An endangered language is a language that is at risk of falling out of use as its speakers die out or shift to speaking another language. Language loss occurs when the language has no more native speakers and becomes a dead language. If eventually no one speaks the language at all, it becomes an extinct language. Although languages have always become extinct throughout human history, they are currently disappearing at an accelerated rate by the processes of globalization and neocolonialism, and the economically powerful languages dominate other languages. More commonly spoken languages dominate the less commonly spoken languages, and so the latter eventually disappear. The total number of languages in the world is not known. Estimates vary depending on many factors. The general consensus is that there are between 6,000 and 7,000 languages currently spoken, and that between 50 and 90% of them will have become extinct by 2100. The 20 most common languages, spoken by more than 50 million speakers each, are spoken by 50% of the world's population, but many of the other languages are spoken by small communities, most of them with fewer than 10,000 speakers. UNESCO operates with 4 levels of language endangerment: beyond safe, based on intergenerational transfer; vulnerable, definitely endangered, severely endangered, and critically endangered. Using an alternative scheme of classification, linguist Michael E. Krauss defines languages as safe if it is considered that children will probably be speaking them in 100 years, endangered if children will probably not be speaking them in 100 years, and moribund if children are not speaking them now. There is a general consensus that the loss of languages harms the cultural diversity of the world. Many projects are underway aimed at preventing or slowing this loss by revitalizing endangered languages and promoting education and literacy in minority languages. Across the world, many countries have enacted specific legislation aimed at protecting and stabilizing the language of indigenous speech communities. A few linguists have argued that language loss is a natural process that should not be counteracted, and that recording endangered languages for posterity is sufficient. Almost all speakers of endangered languages consider the loss of the language to be a vital break with the cultural identity and tradition, and many work actively to counteract the impending language loss, often working closely with linguists in revitalization projects. Recognizing that most of the world's endangered languages are unlikely to be revitalized, many linguists are working on documenting the thousands of languages of the world about which little or nothing is known. The work may prove helpful both for the science of linguistics and in the future for the descendants of the speech communities if they wish to learn about their ancestral language after it has become extinct. Number of languages. The total number of contemporary languages in the world is not known, and it is not well defined what constitutes a separate language as opposed to a dialect. Estimates vary depending on the extent and means of the research undertaken, and the definition of a distinct language and the current state of knowledge of remote and isolated language communities. The number of known languages varies over time as some of them become extinct and others are newly discovered. One of the most active research agencies is SIL International, which maintains a database, Ethnologue, kept up to date by the contributions of linguists globally. Ethnologue's 2005 count of languages in its database, excluding duplicates in different countries, was 6,912, of which 32.8% were in Asia, and 30.3% in Africa. This contemporary tally must be regarded as a variable number within a range. Areas with a particularly large number of languages that are nearing extinction include Eastern Siberia, Central Siberia, Northern Australia, Central America, and the Northwest Pacific Plateau. Other hotspots are Oklahoma and the southern cone of South America. Endangered sign languages. Almost all of the study of language endangerment has been with spoken languages. A UNESCO study of endangered languages does not mention sign languages. However, some sign languages are also endangered, such as Alipur Village Sign Language of India, Adamorobe Sign Language of Ghana, Bangkor Sign Language of Thailand, and Plains Indian Sign Language. Many sign languages are used by small communities. Small changes in their environment can lead to the endangerment and loss of the traditional sign language. Methods are being developed to assess the vitality of sign languages, defining and measuring endangerment. While there is no definite threshold for identifying a language as endangered, UNESCO's 2003 document entitled Language Vitality and Endangerment outlines 9 factors for determining language vitality: intergenerational language transmission, absolute number of speakers, proportion of speakers existing within the total population, language use within existing contexts and domains, response to language use in new domains and media, availability of materials for language education and literacy, government and institutional language policies, community attitudes toward the language, amount and quality of documentation. Many languages, for example some in Indonesia, have tens of thousands of speakers but are endangered because children are no longer learning them, and speakers are shifting to using the national language in place of local languages. In contrast, a language with only 500 speakers might be considered very much alive if it is the primary language of the community, and is the first spoken language of all children in that community, asserting that language diversity is essential to the human heritage. UNESCO's ad hoc expert group on endangered languages offers this definition of an endangered language. Quote, when its speakers cease to use it in an increasingly reduced number of communicative domains, and cease to pass it on from one generation to the next. That is, there are no new speakers, adults or children. UNESCO's Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger categorizes 2,473 languages into 5 levels of endangerment: vulnerable, definitely endangered, severely endangered, critically endangered, and extinct. More than 200 languages have become extinct around the world over the last 3 generations. Many scholars have devised techniques for determining whether languages are endangered. One of the earliest is GIDS, proposed by Joshua Fishman in 1991. In 2011, an entire issue of Journal of Multilingual and Multicultural Development, devoted to the study of ethno-linguistic vitality, Volume 32.2, 2011, with several authors presenting their own tools for measuring language vitality. A number of other published works on measuring language vitality have been published, prepared by authors with varying situations and applications in mind. Causes. According to the Cambridge Handbook of Endangered Languages, there are 4 main types of causes of language endangerment. There are those causes that put the populations that speak the languages in physical danger, such as natural disasters, famine, disease. An example of this is the languages spoken by the people of the Andaman Islands, who were seriously affected by the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. War and genocide. Examples of this are the language of the indigenous population of Tasmania who were wiped out by colonists, and many extinct and endangered languages of the Americas where indigenous peoples have been subjected to genocidal violence, or in the cases of the Mosquito language in Nicaragua and the Mayan languages of Guatemala have been affected by civil war. and there are those causes which prevent or discourage speakers from using a language, such as political repression. This has frequently happened when nation-states working to promote a single national culture limit the opportunities for using minority languages in the public sphere, schools, the media, and elsewhere, sometimes even prohibiting them altogether. Sometimes ethnic groups forcibly resettled, or children may be removed to be schooled away from home, or otherwise have their chances of cultural and linguistic continuity disrupted. This has happened in the case of many Native American and Australian languages, as well as European and Asian minority languages such as Breton or Alsatian in France and Kurdish in Turkey. Cultural, political, economic marginalization, hegemony. This happens when political and economical power is closely tied to a particular language and culture, so that there is a strong incentive for individuals to abandon the language in favor of another more prestigious one. This frequently happens when indigenous populations, in order to achieve a higher social status, have better chance to get employment, or are forced to it in school, adopt the cultural and linguistic traits of a people who have come to dominate them through colonization, conquest, or invasion. Examples of this kind of endangerment of the Welsh and Scots language in Great Britain, the Ainu language in Japan, and the Chamorro language in Guam. This is the most common cause of language endangerment. Sometimes more than one of these causes act at the same time, as poverty, disease and disasters often affect minority groups disproportionately, for example causing the dispersal of speaker populations and decreased survival rates for those who stay behind. In addition, cultural hegemony may often arise not from domination or conquest but simply from increasing contact with a larger and more influential language community through better communications compared with the relative isolation of past centuries. Marginalization and endangerment. Among the causes of language endangerment, cultural, political and economic marginalization accounts for most of the world's language endangerment. Scholars distinguish between several types of marginalization. Economic dominance negatively affects minority languages when poverty leads people to migrate towards the cities or to other countries, thus dispersing the speakers. Cultural dominance occurs when literature and higher education is only accessible in the majority language. Political dominance occurs when education and political activity is carried out exclusively in a majority language. Historically, in colonies, and elsewhere where speakers of different languages have come into contact, some languages have been considered superior to others. Often one language has attained a dominant position in a country. Speakers of endangered languages may themselves come to associate the language with negative values such as poverty, illiteracy and social stigma, causing them to wish to adopt the dominant language which is associated with social and economical progress and modernity. Immigrants moving into an area may lead to the endangerment of the autochthonous language. Effects. Language endangerment affects both the languages themselves and the people that speak them. Effects on communities. As communities lose the language, they often also lose parts of the cultural traditions which are tied to that language, such as songs, myths and poetry that are not easily transferred to another language. This may in turn affect the sense of identity, producing a weakened social cohesion as the values and traditions are replaced with new ones. This is sometimes characterized as anomie. Losing a language may also have political consequences, as some countries confer different political statuses or privileges on minority ethnic groups, often defining ethnicity in terms of language. That means that communities that lose the language may also lose political legitimacy as a community with special collective rights. Effects on languages. During language loss, sometimes referred to as obsolescence in the linguistic linguistic literature, the language that is being lost generally undergoes changes as speakers make the language more similar to the language that they are shifting to. For example, gradually losing grammatical or phonological complexities that are not found in the dominant language. Language endangerment. Generally, the accelerated pace of language endangerment is considered to be a problem by linguists and by the speakers. However, some linguists, such as the late phonetician Peter Leitfeld, have argued that language death is a natural part of the process of human cultural development, and that languages die because communities stop speaking them for their own reasons. Leitfeld argued that linguists should simply document and describe languages scientifically, but not seek to interfere with the processes of language loss. A similar view has been argued at length by linguist Sally Coco-Mullinek, who sees the cycles of language death and emergence of new languages through creolization as a continuous ongoing process. A majority of linguists consider that language loss is an ethical problem, as they consider that most communities would prefer to maintain the languages if given a real choice, as well as a scientific problem, because language loss on the scale currently taking place will mean that future linguists will only have access to a fraction of the world's linguistic diversity, and will therefore have a skewed picture of what human language is and can be. Some linguists consider linguistic diversity to be analogous to biological diversity, and compare language endangerment to wildlife endangerment. Response. Linguists, members of endangered language communities, governments, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations such as UNESCO and the European Union are actively working to save and stabilize endangered languages. Once a language is determined to be endangered, there are 3 steps that can be taken in order to stabilize or rescue the language. The first is language documentation, the second is language revitalization, and the third is language maintenance. Language documentation is the documentation in writing and audio-visual recording of grammar, vocabulary, and oral traditions of endangered languages. It entails producing descriptive grammars, collections of texts and dictionaries of the languages, and it requires the establishment of a secure archive where the material can be stored once it is produced so that it can be accessed by future generations of speakers or scientists. Language revitalization is the process by which a language community, through political, community, and educational means, attempts to increase the number of active speakers of the endangered language. This process is also sometimes referred to as language revival or reversing language shift. Vocabulary and courses are available online for a number of endangered languages. Language maintenance refers to the support given to languages that need for the survival to be protected from outsiders who can ultimately affect the number of speakers of a language. Another option is post-vernacular maintenance, the teaching of some words and concepts of the lost language, rather than revival proper. As of June 2012, the United States has a J1 specialist visa, which allows indigenous language experts who do not have academic training to enter the U.S. as experts aiming to share the knowledge and expand the skills.